Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. May 10th, 2017, Mother's Day in Mexico. Miriam Rodríguez locked the door of the Rodeo Boots store just after 10:20 p.m. She'd stayed late to finish the books in the quiet hours after closing, away from the constant interruptions that had defined her day. Calls from fellow merchants, calls from grieving families, a mother whose son had recently been murdered in Guanajuato, the usual weight of other people's tragedies pressing against her own. She climbed into her car and began the drive south toward her home in the Paso Real neighborhood. By 10:30, she'd reached her street, a dark, unpaved road where her headlights cut through the darkness against gravel and dust. She pulled into her driveway and opened the door, reaching for the crutches she'd been forced to use for weeks. The injury came during a surveillance operation on La Guerra Soto, a Zeta Cartel member who'd been part of the cell that kidnapped her daughter, Karen. Miriam had tracked Soto to a house where she was working as a nanny, then leaped from her vehicle and tackled the woman by the hair. In the fall, Miriam's foot had broken, but Soto had been arrested. That was the pattern now. Miriam found them. Miriam brought them in. One by one, she'd helped put some of the top figures in the Zeta organization behind bars. Half of them were free again. They had recently escaped from the penitentiary in Ciudad Victoria and were seeking revenge. 100 feet away, tucked into the shadows near a neighbor's yard, a white Nissan truck sat with its engine off. Inside, several men waited. As Miriam struggled out of her car with her crutches, 2 men stepped out of the truck. They were carrying 9mm pistols. The early morning hours of March 31st, 2010, was marked by what initially appeared to be a routine call to the police. A fisherman's truck had reportedly overturned along the highway south of San Fernando, a city in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, a few miles before the Y junction that separated the entrance to town from a freeway. A small crew of local policemen and paramedics, including Captain Angel's firefighter squad, which served as first responders, raced out of San Fernando to the site at kilometer marker 153, nestled in the foothills of the Loma Prieta mountain. The scene appeared unremarkable: a single driver who refused medical attention and a rolled truck. The paramedics, local cops, and federal highway officers stood in the quiet stupor often associated with early morning traffic incidents, awaiting further instructions. For months, rumors of a brewing war between the Gulf and the Zeta cartels had circulated. Following their split, anonymous social media posts had even warned of an imminent assault on San Fernando by the Zetas, who had been run out of town by the Gulf Cartel in January 2010. While the border town of Reynosa and other areas in Tamaulipas had already experienced violence as the two groups battled for territorial control, San Fernando had remained relatively quiet. By March 2010, the vigilance of the local police, who took their orders from the Gulf Cartel, had waned, with some even dismissing the warnings of a Zeta assault as mere bluster. Instead of positioning lookouts along the highway leading to Ciudad Victoria, a Zeta stronghold, about 15 police units were stationed within San Fernando's town limits. Captain Angel felt uneasy as he scanned the area around the crash site. The highway undulated before abruptly swerving south toward the state capital, the bend concealed by a large mountain. Angel had been hearing increasing reports of shootings along the highways. Just the day before, 2 federal highway cops had been killed in Las Norias, south of their current location. He instructed his men to pack up, not wanting them to linger on the road unnecessarily. Some of his crew demurred, wanting to finish smoking, but Angel reminded them of the recent killings in Las Norias, stating, "Well, those people are still out there." As they began to gather their equipment, the officers heard movement along the edges of the highway, a low rumble. Suddenly, a cascade of lights pierced the darkness of the scrubland, tearing along the dirt roads that ran parallel to the highway, accompanied by the growing sound of engines and tires on sand. For a moment, the police froze, mesmerized and terrified by the unexpected light show. The sight of dozens of trucks snapped them out of their paralysis. Someone was coming, having waited in the dark for the opportune moment. A parade of heavy-duty vehicles then spilled onto the highway, a chaotic display of trucks, trailers, SUVs, and gun-mounted rigs spray-painted with the letter Z. The convoy sped toward San Fernando like unhinged fighters heading into their first battle. The police, with a brief head start, fled, bellowing into their radios. "They're shooting at us! They're shooting at us! These bastards are coming from all sides." Near the entrance to town, the Zeta convoy split, with some vehicles diverting to the highway bypass, looping east toward the town center, while others drove directly toward the fleeing police convoy on the south side. This second group chased the police vehicles, firing wildly at the patrol cars, which nearly crashed into their parked colleagues outside the trade school. The officers at the checkpoint, having abandoned their posts, cowered in a nearby construction site as their vehicles were riddled with gunfire for nearly 10 minutes, turning the squad cars into burning wreckage. The panicked cries on the police radio frequencies went unanswered. Captain Angel heard the frantic calls as he and his men drove back toward town. He decided to pull his vehicle to the side of the bypass. His boss called, warning him that the city was no longer safe. The Zeta convoy had broken through the police blockade and was wreaking havoc, attacking every government building with automatic gunfire. The deep explosions of 50 caliber rounds echoed through town. In his rearview mirror, Angel saw another convoy speeding toward him. Accepting his imminent death, he reclined in his seat. However, as the vehicles passed, they weren't shooting. They were honking their horns, mocking him, and calling for him to join them. He counted 49 vehicles in all. The Zeta takeover of San Fernando began with a brazen display of force, an assault on the symbols of government authority that signaled the start of a reign of terror. Shortly after midnight on January 24, 2014 in San Fernando, 34-year-old Azam Rodríguez had been awakened by the shuffling of feet and a groan she immediately recognized as her father, Luis, approaching her front door. Having last spoken to her younger sister, 20-year-old Karen, at 3:30 p.m. the previous day, Azalea had grown increasingly worried when her sister failed to respond to calls and messages throughout the evening. Her unease was confirmed by the disheveled and frightened state of her father, from whom she had been estranged for nearly 2 years. As Luis stepped inside, his phone rang, and Azalea instinctively knew it concerned Karen. The caller, identifying himself as a member of the Zeta Cartel and part of the group holding Karen, stated that after much discussion, they were demanding a ransom of 1 million pesos, around $75,000, for her return. Then Karen herself came on the phone, her voice sounding less than certain as she urged her father to pay, claiming it was solely about the money and that her release would follow. The call ended abruptly, leaving Azalea and her father in stunned silence, grappling with the enormity of the demand. Azalea then made the difficult call to her brother, Luis Hector, who lived in Ciudad Victoria, and immediately promised to return home. Finally, she faced the call she dreaded most, informing her mother of Karen's kidnapping. Miriam Rodríguez, then working as a housekeeper and nanny in McAllen, Texas, received a distressing 4 a.m. phone call from her daughter Azalea. Miriam, without hesitation, packed her belongings, left a note for her employers, and by 6 a.m. was waiting for a bus from Reynosa to San Fernando, embarking on a 2-hour journey through the heart of Tamaulipas, the same route she had traveled with Karen as a toddler over 20 years prior. This return trip was marked by profound grief and a growing understanding of the chasm left by a kidnapped loved one. As the bus traveled through the near-dark, Miriam sat near the back and wept silently. Others on the bus attempted to offer consolation, recognizing her distress. However, Miriam, who typically maintained a guarded demeanor around strangers, was consumed by her sorrow. It was during this journey, amidst her private anguish laid bare in the shared space of public transport, that an interaction occurred that would prove pivotal in her relentless pursuit of justice. An elderly man, seated across the aisle from her, extended a simple gesture of human kindness. He handed Miriam his handkerchief and asked, "Are you okay?" Despite her usual reticence, Miriam received his compassion. Instinctively knowing what this was about, kidnappings for ransom was a booming business at the time. The man shared with her that his son was a Mexican Marine and provided a piece of paper containing his contact information, Lieutenant Alex, assuring Miriam that he would help her with what she needed. Meanwhile, Azalea and her father drove to Miriam's house, where Karen had been living. Luis recounted having already visited the house after the initial call at midnight, finding Karen's truck gone but the lights and television left on. Arriving again near dawn, they found the front door unlocked and Karen's purse inside, its contents spilled out, a detail absent from Luis's earlier visit. The house was in disarray, suggesting a struggle. As Luis went home to shower before heading to the bank to seek a loan for the ransom, Azalea went to the bus station to meet her mother. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez was born in February 1993 in San Fernando, Tamaulipas. She was the youngest child of Miriam Rodríguez and Luis Salinas, an unexpected pregnancy that briefly reconciled her parents' failing marriage. Her family would later describe her as an animated baby doll with rosy skin and canary-colored blonde hair. From the beginning, Karen's life was marked by medical challenges. She was born with a malformed hip socket and a heart murmur, and Mexican doctors initially believed she would spend her life in a wheelchair. But Miriam refused to accept this prognosis. When Karen was 1 year old, Miriam secured pro bono treatment at the Shriners Hospital for Children in Houston. Karen was fitted with a platinum hip cap and placed in a full-body cast. The treatment worked. Karen grew up in the San Fernando market, where her parents ran their businesses, and she learned to walk using a tiny walker, moving between the Rodeo Boots store and the home goods store her family owned. She was held so much by family and market vendors that she seldom had to crawl. She became the mascot of the family, doted on by her older siblings. For years, Karen traveled to Houston for monthly checkups, a routine that continued until she reached her full adult size at 18. The miracle of her mobility defined her early life. She'd beaten the odds. Karen's childhood was spent in the commercial bustle of the market, raised in a middle-class family of merchants. She was soft-hearted, less materialistic than her siblings, and known to take indigent women off the street to clean them up and give them clothes. In 2010, when Karen was 17, the town changed overnight with the violent Zeta takeover. Lockdowns became routine. Fear became constant. The rebellious streak that had already begun to emerge in Karen intensified under these conditions. Under this new regime, the rhythm of daily life was dictated by Zeta-imposed curfews and random roadblocks, forcing businesses like OXXO to shutter by 5 p.m. and families to huddle in their homes with the lights off. The constant threat of becoming one of the disappeared, those snatched from the streets and dumped into mass graves, became a routine horror for the population. For Karen, these oppressive conditions coincided with a seismic domestic rupture, the breakdown of her parents' 33-year marriage. While her older siblings were already independent, Karen was the, quote, baby of the family who was still living at home, causing her to internalize her mother Miriam's bitterness and humiliation over her father's public infidelities. The rebellious streak that had begun as a typical teenage response intensified into a dangerous, treacherous lifestyle as Karen sought to escape her toxic home life and the cartel's suffocating constraints. She transitioned into a goth phase, wearing all-black clothing, dark lipstick, and chokers, while expressing a profound melancholy to friends. She became a fixture of the roll, a practice of driving circles around the town's main drag, La Calle Ancha, at all hours of the night, despite the risk of encountering Zeta checkpoints. After graduating high school, Karen moved to Ciudad Victoria in 2012 to study psychology at the Autonomous University of Tamaulipas. She lived with two friends, trying to build a life beyond San Fernando. But by late 2013, she discovered she disliked psychology and moved back home to prepare for a transfer to a radiology program. Her return coincided with a personal crisis. Her parents' marriage finally collapsed. The separation deeply affected Karen, and her relationship with her father deteriorated. She began staying out late, drinking, and driving alone at all hours. The volatility manifested in dramatic ways. Once she chased her father and his new girlfriend through town, eventually attacking his car with her shoe during a traffic stop. While Miriam worked as a nanny in McAllen, Karen managed rodeo boots. But her social life raised concerns. Her best friend was Fanny Sanchez, and they spent most of their time at an estate called La Ciudadela. She was also involved with Juan Manuel, a Venezuelan man in his late 30s who worked for an oil company. Miriam suspected he was married with children. Karen also associated with Barbara Villafranca, a woman with Zeta connections, and a young girl called La Chaparra, whom Karen treated like a mascot. Karen had no criminal history. She was impetuous, prone to acting without thinking, once jumping on a soapy car hood while washing it, resulting in a leg injury. But she wasn't involved with the cartels. That didn't stop rumors. She'd once posted a photo of herself online wearing a bulletproof vest she'd tried on in a police officer's vehicle. In San Fernando, where suspicion ran deep and the Zetas controlled perception, that single image would later be twisted into false claims of cartel involvement. On January 23, 2014, Karen was weeks away from her 21st birthday when she was abducted from her mother's home in the Paso Real neighborhood of San Fernando. The abduction followed a trap that began the previous evening at a birthday party for a friend named Pancho, where Karen met a young man named Ulises. On the day of the kidnapping, Karen left a meal with her cousin after receiving a call to give Ulises a ride. While driving with Ulises and Barbara, their vehicle was cut off by a white sedan carrying 3 armed men who forced Karen into the back under the threat of being shot with an AK-47. The Zetas then returned Karen to her mother's house, which they used as a site for brutal torture and interrogation. Inside the home, Karen was bound by her hands and feet while being kicked and punched by captors C-Can and Quitol. A third individual, El Chepo, led the assault, using a gray plastic bag to repeatedly suffocate Karen in a torture method known as the bag, while accusing her of leaking information to the rival Gulf cartel. The friends involved in the trap were also present or captured. Carlos, a mechanic and family friend who arrived at the house to fix Karen's truck, was seized by the Zetas upon entry and forced to witness Karen lying on the floor, swollen and bloody. On the bus, nearing San Fernando, Miriam's anxiety was palpable. She asked the driver to stop a few blocks before the terminal, wary of potential Zeta surveillance. Embracing Azalea on the street, Miriam's relief at seeing her daughter was short-lived as her phone rang. It was the same voice that had contacted Luis, now brusque and demanding with Miriam. After outlining their demands, the caller passed the phone to Karen. Miriam's voice cracked with guilt and fear as she asked about her daughter's well-being, but Karen, sounding rehearsed, insisted it was only about the money. The kidnapper hung up abruptly, leaving Miriam in tears. Luis, having secured a loan, local banks had grimly begun offering loans for such purposes, was finalizing the details when the kidnappers called again, demanding the money earlier than agreed. Despite his objections, they insisted the ransom be delivered alone to the San Fernando Health Center. The family pooled their life savings with the bank loan, amounting to less than $10,000. Miriam positioned herself down the street from the health center to observe the handoff. 2 hours late, a teenage boy arrived, collected the money, and tersely told Luis that Karen would be at the cemetery in 20 minutes. They drove to the cemetery and waited in vain until dark. Calls to the kidnappers yielded assurances of bad weather delaying Karen's release. The following day passed with agonizing anticipation. An unspoken fear began to take hold. What if Karen wasn't coming back? The next morning brought a call from a neighbor. A cherry red Explorer had been seen outside Miriam's house, and 2 women had entered with a key, leaving with a jacket, shoes, and Karen's purse. The family clung to this as a sign of hope. However, later that day, the kidnappers called again, demanding more money. Luis, emotionally and financially depleted, refused to respond. Miriam's enraged exclamation of their lack of further funds was met with silence. Calling the police remained out of the question, deemed too dangerous for Karen. With nothing else to do, Miriam asked Azalea's husband Ernesto to take her to her own house. Despite her apprehension, she felt a growing curiosity about the kidnappers and any clues they might have left behind. En route, at a local diner called Las Palmas, Miriam spotted the cherry red Explorer the neighbor had mentioned and saw 2 men leaving, one of whom she thought looked familiar. Inside her house, Miriam found further signs of the kidnapping and a struggle, including cut charging cords and scattered papers. She also discovered a work ID belonging to Karen's Venezuelan boyfriend and a pair of men's boots. The scattered evidence offered no clear answers. That evening, a visitor arrived at Azalea's house, Carlos's mother. The kidnappers had called her that morning demanding a ransom, and upon hearing she had no money, declared they would send him back in pieces. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. The following day, while driving, Miriam noticed the red Explorer following her. Before she could react, the driver cut her off, and 2 young men emerged. The taller one, asking if she was Karen's mother, instructed her to meet him alone in 10 minutes at restaurant El Junior. Inside, Miriam sat across from the Zeta, whom she recognized from Las Palmas. He was referred to as Sama on his handheld radio, and he claimed to be a commander who could help get Karen back. Another younger man sat beside him, eating. Sama assured Miriam that Karen was alive and well, even suggesting she was unusually relaxed. He stated that he wanted to let her go, but needed the approval of El Larry, who ran the Zeta Cartel in San Fernando. Sama offered his help for $1,600. Despite her distrust, the overwhelming desire to believe Karen was alive led Miriam to agree. Having been taken to the restaurant by Azalea, Miriam had no choice but to accept Sama's offer to take her home. Being seen entering her older daughter's car after being told to be there alone was too much of a risk not worth taking. Sama then drove her back to Azalea's, revealing he already knew where she was staying. More than a week passed with no word after paying Sama. Azalea's living room became a makeshift operations center, filled with the signs of worry. Occasional calls from unknown numbers raised fleeting hopes, often turning out to be unrelated ransom demands. 2 weeks after Karen's disappearance, a call seemed genuine, with the voice on the line claiming the commander had ordered Karen's return for a small additional payment. Despite her suspicion, Miriam paid the $400, the penury of love driving her to grasp at any possibility. She waited in the plaza until nightfall, well past the designated time, before accepting it was another false hope. 2 weeks after Karen's disappearance, Miriam and Azalea were driving, searching for the red Explorer, when they spotted Karen's friend La Chapara at a roadside meat shop, acting suspiciously. Miriam noted the restaurant's strategic location with a clear view of the old municipal dump, rumored to be a Zeta camp, suspecting La Chapara was a lookout. Not long after, at a grocery store, Miriam saw Sama with an older man she assumed was his boss. Confronting Sama, she demanded to know Karen's whereabouts. Startled, Sama gave her a number and promised to speak later before hurrying after his associate. Days turned to weeks, and Miriam saw the truth before anyone else dared to speak it. One night, on the 1-month anniversary of Karen's disappearance, a transformation occurred. She turned to Azalea and said it out loud. "Karen's never coming home." Her voice was steel. No tears, no trembling, just cold, burning resolve. She picked up her purse, walked to Luis's truck, pulled out the scrap of paper with Lieutenant Alex's number, and dialed. Miriam Rodríguez was born in 1960, the youngest of 9 children, on a ranch known as Rancho Loma Prieta, located about 12 miles south of San Fernando. Her parents were ranch hands and farmers who worked a modest 30-acre plot, cultivating sorghum and corn and raising animals primarily for their own consumption. Being born 20 years after her oldest sibling, Miriam benefited from the changing times, receiving an opportunity for education in town alongside her brother Jorge, a privilege not afforded to her older siblings who worked on the ranch with their father. San Fernando, for the better part of 2 centuries, had been a small cattle ranching town, but by the time of Miriam's birth, it was undergoing significant urbanization. Known then as Villa San Fernando, it was still a place where most residents knew each other. Miriam, however, possessed a certain sophistication and quick intellect that set her apart. Even as a young girl, she advised her older brothers on their problems and excelled in school, even teaching herself to type before graduating. As a teenager, Miriam displayed a strong-willed and determined personality, finding it difficult to concede a point. In high school, she fell in love with Luis Salinas, a conceited athlete. They began dating, meeting secretly away from her parents' watchful eyes. Miriam was 3 years younger than Luis, whose family owned a household goods store in town. Their relationship progressed until Luis graduated and moved to the United States to work in a factory, seeking opportunities beyond the limited scope of agriculture and ranching in San Fernando at the time. Not long after Luis's departure, at the age of 17, Miriam discovered she was pregnant. In the conservative social climate of 1970s Mexico, this news led her parents to all but disown her. Luis was unaware of the pregnancy, and Miriam chose not to tell him, as their communication had ceased after he left for Texas without any explicit promises of a future together. Rather than apologizing for her situation, Miriam demonstrated her independence by packing her bags and moving to the opposite end of the country to live with her eldest sister, Socorro. There, she supported herself by selling Avon products, displaying a knack for connecting with people, and a charmingly pushy sales style. Despite her initial resolve, Miriam grew restless for home. Her foray into business was driven by a singular goal: to return to San Fernando and forge her own life. 3 weeks after giving birth to her daughter Azalea in December 1977, Miriam returned to San Fernando, testing her parents' pronouncements of disownment. Seeing their grandchild soften their stance, and Miriam moved back home. She still maintained her stubborn nature by refusing to contact Luis, believing he would reach out if he wanted to see her again. An eventual encounter with his sisters in town, who recognized Azalea as Luis's child, led to them informing him, and he proposed marriage a few days later. They married in January 1978, altering Azalea's birth date to shield her from the social stigma of being born out of wedlock. Eager to return to work, Luis left for the United States shortly after the wedding. Miriam resumed life as a single mother, now with her parents' approval. She found employment with the government, which was expanding its efforts to modernize farming in Mexico. This job not only provided a good income, but also valuable benefits, allowing Miriam to build a life for her family during a time of economic prosperity known as the Mexican Miracle. Working in the agriculture department, Miriam served as a key point of contact for local farmers and ranchers, drawing on her own background as the daughter of a farmhand to understand their needs. She also displayed her entrepreneurial spirit by starting a side business selling cowboy boots, which she sourced from Guanajuato and found a ready market for in San Fernando. Their family grew with the birth of a son, Luis Hector, in 1984, and later in 1992, their youngest daughter, Karen, was born, marking a period of relative financial ease for the family. In 1997, a significant health crisis impacted Miriam's life when, at the age of 37, she received a diagnosis of cancer. This news came as a shock, and the doctor's initial prognosis was dire, suggesting she would face a difficult battle. Determined to survive for her 3 young children, Miriam confronted the challenge of securing adequate medical care after her departure from her government position. The family made the decision for Luis to formalize his business, allowing him to hire Miriam and provide her with access to the IMSS healthcare system. After the initial operation, the same doctor informed Miriam that the surgery was unsuccessful and the cancer was still present, suggesting a terminal situation. Miriam subsequently found a highly recommended specialist who worked within the IMSS system in Matamoros. She underwent long weeks of radiation and chemotherapy, commuting by bus and often returning nauseated from the treatment. A year into it, her doctor suggested removing her uterus. Following this surgery, Miriam began a slow recovery process. Her children, Luis Hector and Azalea, helped clean her wounds to prevent infection. Miriam's return to health was complicated by the treatment impacting her thyroid, causing her to gain weight rapidly. Despite this, she remained deeply involved in her children's lives. Years later, around 2007, when considering gastric bypass surgery, Miriam referenced her past cancer diagnosis when asked by Azalea if she was frightened of the procedure, saying, "I feel like I answered that question with the cancer diagnosis. If that didn't kill me, you think this will?" This newfound physical freedom allowed her to more readily manage her businesses, help care for Azalea's son born in 2000, and visit Luis Hector, who returned to Ciudad Victoria in 2007 to finish his studies. Up until 2013, Miriam had established herself as a resilient and determined individual, navigating significant personal and health challenges while raising her family and running successful businesses in San Fernando. As her children transitioned into young adulthood, the town itself was experiencing a shift with the growing presence and influence of drug cartels. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Having encountered Sama and others involved in the ransom demands, Miriam came to understand that her initial belief that Karen might still be alive eventually gave way to the assumption she was dead. It was at this point she pondered how to track down the people responsible. Miriam had a history of taking action herself. Back in 1989, she had found culprits and recovered stolen goods after thieves emptied her husband's safe. And in 2012, she had insisted on paying the ransom herself when kidnappers threatened her daughter Azalea's husband. This fearless and relentless nature, though sometimes making others uneasy, served her mission now. Miriam made Sama her target number 1, setting her sights on finding him. Miriam quickly realized that while the Mexican Marines she began working with from her connection to Lieutenant Alex could conduct lethal operations, they could not build a legal case against the responsible individuals or bring closure. She came to the unwelcome conclusion that she needed to work with the police and leverage state investigators who had the authority to detain suspects and raid homes. To mobilize the system, however, she needed specific information. She was certain she could recognize Sama, but she needed his identity. Without his proper name, the police could not issue a warrant, and as far as the legal system was concerned, he was no one, an alter ego floating over the criminal landscape, a ghost. The system mattered to Miriam because it meant resources and the legal authority to seek justice, but it was dysfunctional and required connections and patience. Getting things done often meant working the rusted gears of the bureaucracy, with a deep familiarity with its Baroque language and an inexhaustible well of patience and energy. Determined to get Sama's real name, Miriam understood there was no magic to investigation, just the need to put in the work, be methodical about your process. Fueled by this understanding and her desperate resolve, Miriam began searching for Sama through available means. For months, she had been searching the name Sama on social media, specifically Facebook, hoping he might make a mistake and reveal his identity or post a photograph. It was through this sustained effort that Miriam experienced a breakthrough. While scrolling through Facebook on her cell phone one day in early July, she let out a shriek. She had found a photograph that, despite being a poor image, was definitively him. She recognized his lanky frame, thin face, and curly hair. Beside Sama in the photograph was a young woman wearing a distinctive uniform, that of a local ice cream chain, Helado Sultana. Miriam realized that this seemingly minor detail was a crucial lead. The Helado Sultana chain, however, had dozens of locations spread across the state. Miriam mentally prepared herself for the monumental task of visiting every single one to find the woman from the photo. Sama had previously told Miriam he had been living in Ciudad Victoria, and this seemed like a logical place to begin her search, as the state capital had only 4 branches of Helado Sultana. The journey to Ciudad Victoria was fraught with danger, involving travel on a single-lane road known to be trafficked by Zetas, but Miriam made the trip repeatedly on her mission. For weeks, she endured long hours sitting outside the entrances of the Helado Sultana locations in Ciudad Victoria, patiently surveilling for the face of the girl she had seen in the Facebook photograph. After weeks of painstaking surveillance, Miriam's perseverance paid off. She finally spotted Sama's girlfriend emerging from one of the Helado Sultana stores. Miriam continued to observe the situation, waiting until Sama himself eventually arrived. Now, knowing where he was frequenting, Miriam's next objective was to obtain his real name. To facilitate this, she adopted a disguise. She cut her hair short and dyed it a bright red, a color she believed was attention-grabbing, that distracted from one's face. She retrieved an old uniform and her expired government ID card from her previous employment with the state health department, intending to play the part of a state worker. Dressed in her disguise, Miriam returned to the neighborhood in Ciudad Victoria, where she had followed Sama and his girlfriend. With her expired identification card displayed around her neck, she began a systematic process, starting with the first house on the street. Going door to door, Miriam conducted a mock survey of every home on the block. She asked residents questions, such as the number of children, adults, and elderly people living there, ensuring her questions were convincing enough to maintain her cover. Crucially, she also asked for the names and birth dates of all residents, recording this information in an official-looking notebook. By the conclusion of that day, Miriam had successfully gathered the details of everyone on the block. Among this acquired information was the specific piece she had desperately sought, Sama's real name, along with his date of birth, which was December 23, 1994. This hard-earned information, obtained through her own relentless investigative work, finally provided Miriam with the necessary details to formalize a complaint and apply pressure on the police to issue an arrest warrant for Sama. On the afternoon of July 31, 2014, she called the Special Unit for the Investigation and Prosecution of Kidnapping in Tamaulipas, the group responsible for Karen's case. After asking her usual and often futile question about new developments, Miriam relayed the new details she had discovered through her own investigation. She identified the Zeta, known as Sama, and demanded that the state authorities issue an arrest warrant for him. She shared his name, date of birth, the name of his common-law partner, and their shared address, which the agents recorded for the growing case file. She ended the call with her typical promise to continue investigating. Believing she had done their job for them, Miriam expected the authorities to act swiftly. However, a week passed with no action, so Miriam tried another approach, sending them a formal request to launch an investigation into Sama. She later requested that Sama's home be raided, starting with asking officials to confirm his address. Months after Miriam filed the complaint and began applying pressure, fortune intervened. Luis Hector kept several photos of Sama on his cell phone and reviewed them regularly. He had a store selling boots and hats in Ciudad Victoria, located near downtown in the historic center where state government buildings were situated. One evening, Luis Hector planned to close his store early to go to the plaza, but he was delayed because his neighbor asked him to watch her store. He sat on a chair in front of his store, observing dozens of people heading towards the plaza. While waiting, he noticed a shopper trying on hats near the entrance of his store. This young man was tall, skinny, with slightly curly hair, and was wearing jeans and a light blue shirt. Luis Hector felt the individual looked vaguely familiar. The young man commented to someone with him about how cool a hat was and said he would return to buy it tomorrow. Luis Hector then saw the young man with a group that included a mother, a father, and what appeared to be a girlfriend. It was at this moment that it struck him that the young man admiring hats was Sama. Recognizing him, Luis Hector's heart began racing. He immediately jumped up and quickly started closing his store, yanking down the metal curtain and closing the register. He kept his eye on Sama, who was already moving into the crowd with his arm around his girlfriend. Luis Hector fumbled with the locks to the gate as his neighbor returned, waved her off, and raced down the steps into the crowd, not stopping to clear the till or turn off the lights. On the street, Luis Hector followed Sama, maintaining a short distance and being careful not to lose him in the crowds heading towards Plaza 15. He called his mother, who was in her store with Azalea, and asked what he should do. Miriam instructed him, "Don't let him out of your sight," and said she would make a call, telling him to stay with Sama and not let him see him. Miriam then called a federal police officer she had met at restaurant El Junior, who answered right away. She explained the situation, stating her son was following the man responsible for taking her daughter and emphasizing it was a chance to apprehend the bad guy. Miriam passed the officer's phone number to Luis Hector. The officer asked where Luis Hector was, and he whispered his location, in the Centro, heading toward Plaza 15. The officer confirmed he was on his way and told him, "Don't lose him, and don't lose faith." Police checkpoints were already set up at the plaza entrances, requiring everyone, including Sama, to pass through metal detectors. Miriam called Luis Hector repeatedly to check in, but he eventually asked her to stop to avoid potentially making Sama suspicious, as Sama had no idea who Luis Hector was or that he even existed. Luis Hector felt afraid, seeing Sama as the devil himself, and worried about losing him. After about 30 minutes, which felt like an eternity, Luis Hector called the officer again. The officer seemed relaxed and confirmed he was close, heading toward the plaza on foot. Miriam had previously advised the federal police officer not to arrive with a convoy of vehicles, blaring sirens and flashing lights, calling it making a scandal, as it would cause Sama to flee. Luis Hector angled himself towards the main church. The three officers arrived, and he walked them to within 30 feet of Sama. Sama still had his arm around his girlfriend when the commanding officer grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. Luis Hector watched from a distance, finding everything too calm. Through the phone, when Luis Hector called the officer again to ask what was happening, he could hear Sama yelling about a heart condition and claiming he couldn't be a criminal because he was too unhealthy. Luis Hector felt it seemed too friendly and began to fret, calling the officer again and begging him to arrest Sama. The officer laughed, said, "We have him," and told Luis Hector to get his mother there as fast as she could. Sama was not handcuffed, as he was too frightened to run. Officers escorted him out past the barrier fences along the plaza, and Luis Hector lost sight of him. The family later converged at the special unit for kidnapping at the state attorney general's office where Sama had been taken. Luis Hector waited outside for over an hour, his heart still racing, wanting to confront Sama face to face. However, Miriam stopped him at the door, telling him, "No, not you," and adding, "They don't know you exist. You are our secret weapon." After a long night of interrogation, Sama began to talk. He offered some lies, claiming to be only a lookout and hearing secondhand about Karen. However, he could not lie entirely because Miriam was present during the questioning, able to testify that he had personally demanded and received bribes for Karen's rescue. Sama attempted to push the blame onto others, a tactic that ironically gave Miriam an advantage by providing her with more names to investigate. As Miriam jotted down notes, she also fed questions to the investigators. Sama, prompted by questioning influenced by Miriam's knowledge, implicated others, including Cristiano, stating that Cristiano had told him Karen had been killed at a ranch near Paso Real, close to the exit for Ciudad Victoria and the federal police barracks. Sama also corroborated that the ransom payment had been received in San Fernando, handed off by Karen's father nearby the health center. Officials took a photo of Sama shirtless, his face showing fear, his eyes red and appearing to brim with tears. With Sama in custody and talking, Miriam had achieved a critical breakthrough. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Miriam focused her efforts on the next key individual revealed by the unfolding investigation, Cristiano. Miriam had already known Cristiano's name, having heard it months earlier from Carlos, the family friend who had been kidnapped the same night as Karen. Carlos, though traumatized and initially reluctant to speak beyond Facebook messages, had eventually shared more names he overheard while blindfolded: El Chepo, El Flaco de la Ribereña, and Commander Cherokee. Sama's account corroborated Cristiano's involvement and linked him directly to the alleged killing site and the ransom exchange. With El Chepo already in prison for an unrelated kidnapping and C. Can, another name mentioned by Sama, reported dead, Cristiano emerged as a primary target. Sama had placed Cristiano in a position of authority in his own testimony, potentially to divert blame. But Miriam reasoned that Cristiano, with his childish frame and teenage hunger, might be more forthcoming than Sama if apprehended. Eventually, based on the intelligence Miriam gathered, a federal police officer was able to locate Cristiano. He was found more or less where Sama had suggested he would be, peddling dime bags of pot on the street. The officer spotted the young man, who was wearing jeans and a red t-shirt and carrying a backpack. As the officer followed him, Cristiano picked up his pace and began looking left and right, as if preparing to flee down a side street. Before he could make a break for it, the policeman jumped out of his vehicle and arrested him. Cristiano was taken without a fuss and admitted his identity almost immediately. The officers drove Cristiano to the special unit for kidnapping where Sama had been taken. They waited for Miriam to arrive. Miriam was granted access to the interviews, a sign of her critical role in the investigation. As author Azam Ahmed in Fear is Just a Word notes, she knew more than any of the police, and without her, they would not know what questions to ask, how to frame them, or what evidence Miriam had already collected that might implicate Cristiano. Cristiano was clearly shaken during the interrogation, his voice quivering when he spoke. At one point, during a break from the questioning, he asked for his mother and said he was hungry. Hearing him ask for his mother evoked a pang of sympathy in Miriam, a feeling described as more primal than rage. She went into the room where the young man was seated and offered him a piece of wrapped chicken she had brought for herself, in case the interrogation ran long. An officer present was visibly angry and confused by Miriam's act of kindness, noting what Cristiano had done. Miriam, however, calmly shrugged, explaining that it was possible to hold two truths at once: the hatred of a murderer and sympathy for a scared boy. She saw him as a child, regardless of his actions, and hearing him ask for his mother reminded her of her own child. Cristiano spoke as if unburdening himself, sharing details that Sama had only alluded to or omitted entirely. He provided the investigators with new names and context, identifying El Larry as the Zeta boss who directed operations from a truck marked with a municipal logo. He confirmed that a man named Cuitol participated in the kidnapping and was killed by Mexican Marines during their raid on the Basurero ranch, alongside Sican, Margarita, and Jessica. This testimony aligned with Miriam's own experiences. She had orchestrated and personally attended that raid in disguise to find her daughter. The Basurero was a remote location in the El Lodo region near Paso Real, a notorious Zeta camp and slaughterhouse where victims were processed and buried. The chain of events that led to the raid began when Miriam spotted two young women while driving through the central plaza of San Fernando. They were sitting on a bench, laughing and typing into a laptop that Miriam immediately recognized as Karen's. To her, the young women looked like ordinary students, but the presence of her daughter's stolen computer provided a direct link to the kidnappers. Miriam parked her car and called Lieutenant Alex. She convinced the lieutenant that these women either knew what had happened to Karen or knew where the Zeta cell operated. The Marines responded by whisking them away from the plaza for interrogation. Based on the intelligence extracted during questioning, the Marines located the specific ranch. In the early hours of March 10, 2014, the two women, later identified as Margarita Renteria and her friend Jessica, were brought along with the Marine convoy and personally directed the authorities to the site of the old municipal dump. Miriam, driven by a need for closure, insisted on accompanying them. To avoid being spotted by Zeta lookouts, she disguised herself in a Marine uniform to blend into their ranks. When the convoy reached the remote ranch, the Marines advanced on foot. The Zetas initiated a firefight, but the Marines responded with overwhelming and precise force. During the operation, 6 individuals were killed, 3 young men and 3 young women, including Margarita and Jessica. While searching the dilapidated structures, Miriam walked through the grounds in her Marine uniform and saw the red-stained mud floors. She made the crushing discovery of Karen's scarf and seat cushion, offering tangible proof that her daughter had been held at the site. Though the Marines saved the lives of several other kidnapping victims during the operation, Karen was not among the survivors. Cristiano's account would later solidify the site as a mass grave. He recalled being mocked by other Zetas and warned not to walk on churned earth near an old tractor because bodies had recently been buried there. Chalo, the local director of the Funerales La Paz funeral home, was summoned at 2 a.m. to collect the bodies. Despite their involvement in Karen's kidnapping, these individuals were largely abandoned. Of the 6 bodies, only Margarita Renteria was claimed for burial, while the others were eventually interred in common graves in black trash bags. Cristiano's testimony was invaluable because he spoke enough truth, accurately describing the ransom drop at the San Fernando Health Center, to make his lies about Karen being a cartel member feel plausible to the authorities. Miriam understood that the names he provided were merely ghosts in the legal system, requiring her to repeat the methodical shoe-leather research she'd used to find Sama's identity. While she didn't doubt their involvement, she needed to connect these nicknames to physical characteristics, birth dates, and property to force the rusted gears of the Mexican bureaucracy to issue warrants. Months after the raid, in July 2014, Miriam returned to the Basurero with forensic specialists. In the silty earth in front of the same old rusted red tractor Cristiano had identified as a burial site, they recovered 3 human ribs. Though Miriam requested the official designation of a forensic analyst the same day the bones were found, the government's cruelty of ineptitude caused a significant delay. It took until September 27, 2014, for an expert to be officially assigned to the case, and it wasn't until January 2015 that DNA testing finally confirmed those 3 ribs belonged to Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodríguez. Despite this official confirmation, Miriam remained skeptical of the state lab's findings, influenced by a lack of trust in government processes, which she perceived as often unreliable due to incompetence or a desire to obscure the truth. She felt the need to be absolutely certain. Miriam's persistent inquiries, which involved badgering state and federal agencies with formal letters containing precise GPS coordinates of the site, eventually forced the state forensics offices to provide an exhaustive list of every search conducted at the basurero. This list revealed a previously unknown search conducted on May 14, 2014, a date that had remained hidden from Miriam despite her years of searching for the 206 bones that comprise the human body. On that night, at approximately 9:45 p.m., Mexican Marines had summoned forensic services to the basurero to collect a male corpse found partially buried. During the operation, authorities discovered a mass grave near the rusted red tractor where bone fragments were found mixed into the churned mud. The medical examiner distinguished two distinct genetic profiles from these remains, and a meticulous autopsy report documented the designation of forensic specialists and the collection of samples, which were sealed in white envelopes for future legal effects. The State Forensics Lab concluded their DNA tests on June 16, 2014, but the results were sent to the same Ministerio Público in San Fernando, where Miriam would spend the next 2 years fruitlessly asking for information about her daughter. Despite the existence of this clear documentation, the remains were shipped to Chalo, who interred them in a common grave at the Rincon del Valle Cemetery on October 11, 2014. In early 2015, shortly after the one-year anniversary of Karen's disappearance, Miriam Rodríguez founded the Families of the Disappeared of San Fernando, a collective that would come to be known as the Colectivo de Familias de Desaparecidos. The idea came from a year spent navigating the labyrinth of state and federal legal systems in search of her daughter. During that time, Miriam had become an expert in victims' rights laws that most families didn't even know existed. She'd learned that the government would only respond to those who channeled their desperation with purpose, who made their struggle impossible to ignore. As she would later put it, they had to make their struggle their problem. Miriam began with a large black notebook. In it, she recorded names, contact details, and case numbers of local families touched by disappearances. What started as a few jotted names quickly grew into dozens as word of her efforts spread through town. Each entry represented another family living in silent terror, another person who had simply vanished. To understand how to advocate effectively, Miriam attended meetings of other newly formed collectives throughout the state of Tamaulipas. No one had previously dared to organize such a group in the high-risk environment of San Fernando, where the Zetas still held power and anyone who spoke too loudly might disappear themselves. But Miriam studied how others operated, what worked, what didn't. She didn't wait for families to find her. Miriam went looking for them. One day in the San Fernando market, she approached the husband of Maria Inés and encouraged his family to join the collective and seek government assistance. Her store, Rodeo Boots, eventually became a reunion point and respite for families seeking her help, a place where grief could be shared and strategy could be planned. Miriam hosted meetings in event spaces around San Fernando, and at these gatherings, she acted as something between an organizer and a preacher. She told families they no longer needed to be afraid to hide what had happened to them. She taught them that while they were easy to ignore as individuals, they were formidable as a documented group. The government wanted them to remain isolated, ashamed, silent. Miriam was building the opposite. The collective became a weapon against bureaucratic indifference. Miriam used it to jump the line of government apathy, forcing the state to pay for DNA testing, covering funeral costs for murdered children, and transporting victims to the state capitol to demand progress on cold cases that had been deliberately shelved. What one mother couldn't accomplish alone, 20 mothers demanding answers in unison, could not be dismissed. But the collective's work went beyond paperwork and legal pressure. Miriam spearheaded physical searches of suspected Zeta burial sites across San Fernando. She organized working groups with authorities to ensure that recovered bones were matched with family DNA profiles, that the dead were identified and returned to those who mourned them. Through the Families of the Disappeared of San Fernando, Miriam transformed her personal tragedy into a movement. She took the expertise she'd gained hunting for Karen and weaponized it on behalf of dozens of other families. In a place where fear had kept people silent for years, Miriam created a space where they could speak, demand, and search. And she did all of this while continuing her own hunt for the people who had taken her daughter. Miriam learned through Cristiano's testimony that the individuals killed at the Basurero Ranch were half a dozen potential witnesses to Karen's fate that were gone. She recognized she needed to work with state investigators to leverage their authority to detain suspects and gather formal testimony. One critical source of information was Carlos, the family friend who was kidnapped the night Karen was taken when he came to fix her car. Carlos, who miraculously survived and was released, initially communicated with Miriam through sporadic Facebook messages, offering limited details as he was traumatized and scared. Miriam pursued the names given by Carlos and others connected to the Zeta cell. She used her innate investigative skills, which included tracking down families, friends, and former associates of the Zetas. She meticulously built profiles of each target, utilizing handwritten notes, telephone numbers, and addresses. Miriam also exploited the Zeta's own online presence. Many of the young men and women involved in Karen's murder had made tracking them easier by boasting about their exploits on social media platforms like Facebook, posting photos with weapons, drugs, and fellow Zetas. It was in this digital realm that Miriam located a photograph depicting El Flaco standing alongside Sama and Cristiano, their faces displaying youthful bravado. From this image and her other inquiries, Miriam began to construct a profile of El Flaco. The sources describe him as being 21 years old at the time of Karen's kidnapping and murder. He was raised in San Fernando and was slight in build, weighing just under 130 pounds, with a slender frame, a sharp nose, and a narrow face. He was also known to authorities and his associates by the nickname El Flaco de la Ribereña. She understood that those who had left the criminal underworld and were living ostensibly normal lives would be harder to find, as the vastness of the civilian population offered greater anonymity than the comparatively smaller network of active criminals. She needed to find ways to penetrate this civilian world to locate El Flaco. Miriam cultivated a network of contacts across various sectors, including government offices, demonstrating a gift for eliciting cooperation. She befriended a secretary working in the state offices of IMSS, Mexico's National Health Institute. This individual, who had also experienced the loss of a child to violence, became an invaluable ally in Miriam's quest. The secretary took it upon herself to use her access to institutional records to help Miriam locate El Flaco. Through the secretary's efforts, Miriam received crucial intelligence about El Flaco's whereabouts and activities. The secretary discovered that he was working at a factory located in an industrial park approximately 35 miles east of Ciudad Victoria, the state capital. The factory manufactured cables and computer components. The secretary was also able to provide details about his life, such as the fact that he lived in Ciudad Victoria, paid his electricity bills, and was a registered voter. Leveraging this connection, Miriam also managed to obtain copies of official documents pertaining to El Flaco, including his birth certificate, an electric company bill, and a copy of his voter registration card. This type of extrajudicial information gathering was a hallmark of Miriam's investigative work. She meticulously compiled all the gathered materials into a file. Miriam then transmitted this comprehensive file, including El Flaco's address, to the authorities responsible for investigating Karen's case. To ensure her findings were officially documented and could be acted upon, she followed up by detailing everything in a formal written statement submitted to investigators in January 2015. Her persistence yielded results. By February 2015, based on the information Miriam had provided, an arrest warrant was issued for El Flaco. The physical apprehension of El Flaco occurred in the late afternoon of March 24, 2015. Police officers arrived at the industrial park where he was working. An arrest information report was subsequently filed regarding the detention of El Flaco de la Ribereña in Ciudad Victoria. During his preliminary statement, El Flaco confirmed details about his identity, including his age and physical characteristics. El Flaco was the third individual Miriam had successfully tracked down and facilitated the capture of, following Sama and Cristiano. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Miriam's next target was Juan Carlos Morales Cantu, though in legal files he was listed by his nicknames, El Pelon, El Trini. But Miriam knew him by a different name, the Florist. As a child and adolescent, he sold roses on the streets of San Fernando to earn a living. He was a skinny, poorly looked after boy who frequently walked past rodeo booths with a bouquet of roses under his arm. Miriam had known him for years before Karen's abduction. She had a soft spot for him and would often invite him to join her and her children for meals if they were eating when he passed by. Karen treated him with consistent kindness. When she saw him hawking flowers on the town's main drag, La Calle Ancha, she regularly handed him $1 or $2. He had stopped attending school as a child to work. He struggled with literacy and had few prospects beyond washing windows and selling flowers on street corners. Then in 2013, another flower vendor recruited him into the Zetas. That vendor was later beheaded. The economics were simple. As a lookout for the cartel, the florist could earn in a single week what previously took a month of washing windows and selling roses. His role evolved quickly. He monitored military movements at first, then graduated to something more lucrative, the kidnappings for ransom that the Zeta cell used to finance its operations. Eventually, his role evolved to include Karen. He knew the family, he knew their routines, he knew Karen's kindness, her patterns, where she lived. He used that knowledge to facilitate the trap that led to her abduction, part of the slaughterhouse economy that would ultimately claim her life. To Miriam, the florist represented a particularly painful betrayal. He was a boy she had fed, a neighbor her daughter had helped, and he had delivered Karen to the people who killed her. Unlike some of the others involved, the florist was harder to find on social media and barely appeared in the online profiles of his associates. This lack of an online footprint helped him evade Miriam for a longer period. He remained one of Miriam's targets. She continued to pursue every lead, tracking down anyone who might have information about the Zetas responsible. Through her network of sources, she even befriended the widow of a fellow Zeta who was close to the florist. It was from this woman that Miriam received a crucial piece of intelligence. The florist was back living in Matamoros, his hometown. Armed with this tip, Miriam acted swiftly. In the early morning hours of Sunday, March 27, 2016, she traveled to Matamoros, a city located 2 hours north. Her husband, Luis, drove her to the international bridge and parked the truck out of the way, as he often did when Miriam was on her hunts. Miriam was dressed in a trench coat over her pajamas, a baseball cap pulled low to cover her bright red hair. In her coat pocket, she carried a loaded .38 pistol. Miriam scanned the crowds of street vendors along the concrete esplanade leading up to the bridge, studying the faces of everyone she passed. She paused periodically to show locals a photo of the florist, hoping someone might have seen him. She walked along the footpaths and sidewalks, even the narrow entrance to the bridge itself, searching in vain. The triangular plaza with benches and a large tree near the toll plaza was filled with people, but not the florist. As she continued her search along the footpath, Miriam glanced up and noticed a young man selling compact discs. He was roughly 5'8" and slender. Despite the low odds, she moved closer and became certain it was the florist. Miriam slipped her hand into her pocket, gripping her pistol. She was acutely aware that everyone in his old group likely recognized her by now. Even with her hat, her bright red hair was difficult to conceal. She watched him from a distance, frustrated by the circumstances, and decided to call a source in law enforcement to summon the police to the bridge. She knew the police would take time to arrive due to traffic, giving the florist an advantage. However, she also knew he couldn't easily flee into Texas. If he ran, he would have to pass her first. Miriam tried to remain inconspicuous along the narrow footpath, but the density of the crowd meant vendors were pitching wares directly to passers-by. This also meant the florist quickly noticed the woman lurking nearby, watching him with her hands tucked suspiciously in her overcoat. Abandoning his goods on the walkway, the florist took off running. Miriam immediately pulled out her gun. As told by Azam Ahmed in Fear is Just a Word, pedestrians scattered as she grabbed the florist by his shirt and jammed the pistol into his lower back. "If you move, I'll fucking shoot you," she said. She held him there until the police arrived. Miriam also called her police commander friend, Mariano, who had been promoted to statewide operations commander, and he promised to have men available in Matamoros to assist. The police arrived and took the florist into custody. Miriam beamed as the arrest was made. The process of recovering Karen, or at least the first part of it, concluded on February 10, 2016, when the family buried her ribs in a child-sized box within a plot at the San Fernando Cemetery. For Luis Hector, the burial provided an unwelcome final conclusion that Karen was indeed dead, dispelling any lingering hope that she might still be alive. It wasn't until April 2016 that a confrontation of genetic profiles finally confirmed that 2 of the femurs recovered from that May 14th search belonged to Karen. These remains had sat buried and ignored by the bureaucracy for 18 months, until Miriam's letters finally unearthed the truth. The government then granted Chalo permission to exhume these femurs so they could be returned to Miriam. On May 5, 2016, they were formally delivered to Miriam and Luis in Ciudad Victoria. Miriam took possession of these remains and placed them in a silk-lined casket within Chalo's hearse. For this occasion, both Miriam and Chalo dressed formally, providing a sense of continuity amidst the grim circumstances. Upon receiving them, Miriam described them as, "What they left me of my daughter." By March 27, 2016, Miriam had already been instrumental in the arrests of several key figures connected to her daughter Karen's case. But her work was far from over. Among those still at large were El Mario, La Chapara, El Quique, La Guerra Soto, and La Machora. El Mario, an older leader within the Zeta cartel, had been present at the ranch where Karen was held. Miriam had once attempted to detain him herself, pinning him against a wall while awaiting police assistance that never arrived. Undeterred, she continued to gather intelligence, eventually providing law enforcement with a detailed, hand-drawn map indicating his exact location. This led to his arrest without incident. La Chapara, a young woman affiliated with the Zetas, had been tasked with monitoring the road leading to the basurero. Miriam's investigation, which included analyzing GPS data from ransom calls, confirmed La Chapara's involvement and her connection to her grandmother's home, where some of the calls originated. Despite a previous attempt to apprehend her in Ciudad Victoria, which resulted in a physical struggle and her escape, La Chapara was eventually arrested there on August 4, 2016. El Quique was identified as the individual who had pulled the rope used to strangle Karen. Miriam discovered that he was attempting to distance himself from his past, living as a born-again Christian in Ciudad Victoria. On November 14, 2016, she located him at an evangelical church and confirmed his identity. Law enforcement was alerted, and El Quique was apprehended at the church. La Machora, known for subjecting Karen to repeated beatings, became another focus of Miriam's investigation. She compiled an extensive dossier on La Machora, including photographs, social media posts, and personal details. Miriam tracked her to Veracruz, where she was working as a taxi driver. She also located La Machora's son, confirming his school by posing as a family friend. When confronted with evidence of her involvement, La Machora denied it, claiming to be a different person with the same nickname. Nevertheless, she was subsequently arrested. As the year 2016 drew to a close, Miriam Rodríguez remained fully immersed in her relentless pursuit of those responsible for her daughter Karen's death. Her daily life was a detailed investigation, meticulously gathering information on the remaining members of the Zeta cell, compiling handwritten notes with names, telephone numbers, and addresses. Her methodical approach, honed over years of tracking, allowed her to uncover the whereabouts of individuals who believed they had escaped their past. Miriam's success in bringing these Zetas to justice meant that many of the perpetrators involved in Karen's murder, or those connected to the same cell, were now incarcerated. Nearly everyone that Miriam had helped put in prison for Karen's murder was housed in the penitentiary in Ciudad Victoria. This concentration of individuals who had reason to resent Miriam, now held together in a correctional facility, struggling with overcrowding and corruption, created a volatile environment. This situation dramatically escalated on the night of March 22, 2017. In the dead of night, under a sky choked by storm clouds, 29 men slipped through the bowels of the CD's prison, a facility notorious for overcrowding and corruption. Inside, hidden beneath a trapdoor, lay a tunnel, 5 meters deep, stretching 40 meters toward freedom, roughly the length of 4 city buses. Using smuggled tools like crowbars, pickaxes, and even a jury-rigged ventilation system made from plastic pipes, they'd chipped away at the earth. Prison officials later claimed ignorance, but locals whispered of bribes. At 3:14 a.m., chaos erupted. Surveillance footage showed figures sprinting into the storm. One inmate, later identified as Marcos Ortiz, flagged down a passing Nissan Altima. When the driver, 34-year-old mechanic Javier Hernandez, refused to surrender his keys, Ortiz fired a single bullet into his chest. Miriam Rodríguez received the call at dawn. Her investigative efforts and connections led to 11 arrests. Now, half of them were free. Upon hearing the news of the prison break, Miriam frantically searched for information on what had happened, and critically, who had escaped. Prison officials initially had difficulty identifying all the fugitives. However, several hours later, an interim list of escapees, accompanied by mugshots, was released to the media. During this period, Miriam's stress became increasingly evident. Her family observed her growing more upset than usual, particularly obsessing over El Quique's escape and the notion of other escapees, like La Guerra Soto, believed to be Sama's cousin and involved in Karen's killing, potentially planning revenge. Her children and friends grew increasingly fearful for her safety and their own, with her sister-in-law distancing herself and her brother requesting a gun. Despite these palpable fears and entreaties from her loved ones to stop, Miriam remained resolute. She told a journalist friend after the prison break that she suspected she might die for her efforts, but that she could not stop. Her response to the looming threat, as recounted to the journalist, was stark. She hoped the bastards would give her a chance to shoot back when they came for her. Miriam understood that her activism challenged the primacy of organized crime and set a dangerous example for others, making her a target. She knew that if someone wanted to kill her, they could, and she had learned to countenance fear and, to some extent, death itself. However, her requests for protection were largely denied. Authorities across various agencies used what Azam Ahmed describes in his book as flimsy interpretations of the law and narrow definitions of their responsibility to decline her pleas. While the police in San Fernando were eventually tasked with conducting vehicular patrols of her home and workplace, these patrols were inconsistent and inadequate. A commission on human rights investigation later found that the state police agency responsible performed such a poor and erratic job that they initially refused to provide timesheets and later submitted falsified ones to prove they had conducted the patrols. Miriam herself highlighted the lack of effective protection, stating in public that the police officer assigned to her detail barely answered the phone. Following the prison break, Miriam's network of sources conveyed disturbing rumors. An order had been given from inside the prison, described as a nerve center for Zeta commanders, to have her killed. This order was linked to the recent escape, and sources indicated that some of the remaining fugitives had been tasked with carrying out the assassination. On the night of May 10th, 2017, a Mother's Day in Mexico, Miriam Rodríguez finished work and stepped out into the warm air of San Fernando. It was just past 10:20 p.m. She made her way to the car parked out front, climbed in, and began the familiar drive home. By 10:30, she had reached her street. The road was unpaved and dark, the kind of street where the gravel crunched loud beneath tires and headlights were often the only source of light. She parked near the house and opened the door, reaching for her crutches. She had injured her foot when tackling La Guerra Soto during one of her many assistances in catching the Zetas' main figures. 100 feet away, tucked into the shadows near a neighbor's yard, a white Nissan truck sat with its engine off. Inside, several men waited. 2 of them got out. They moved quickly, quietly, both armed with 9mm pistols. The noise of the street, the chirp of insects, the distant sound of televisions from nearby houses was shattered by the gunfire. 13 shots rang out in rapid succession. 8 of them struck Miriam. Inside the house, her husband Luis was watching television when he heard the sound. He leapt from bed and ran to the front window. Miriam's car was there, parked on the road. He shouted her name and bolted outside, pushing through the garage and front gate. She was lying on the ground, face down, just a few steps from her car. One hand was tucked inside her purse, gripping the pistol she always carried. Luis knelt beside her and turned her over. Her eyes were open, her chest was rising, but her breathing was ragged. He couldn't find the wounds. There was no blood, just the sound of her breath and the unmistakable sense that something was very wrong. He pulled out his phone and called Ernesto, Miriam's son-in-law. His voice trembled as he tried to explain what had happened. When he hung up, he called the police. Ernesto then called Azalea. She was still at the taqueria where she worked, the rush of the evening shift behind her. The tension in his voice was unmistakable. It was the same tone she'd heard years earlier when they fled to Texas after Ernesto's attempted kidnapping. She asked what was wrong. "Your mother," he said. "She's been hurt." She pressed him, but he didn't offer more. By the time he picked her up outside the restaurant, she could feel the panic simmering beneath the silence. Their son sat quietly in the back seat. Azalea asked again what had happened. Ernesto avoided the question. They drove quickly, wordlessly, through the streets of San Fernando. As they pulled on to Calle Margarita, just a few houses away from Miriam's, he finally spoke. "She's been shot." Luis was waiting outside, standing under the amber glow of the streetlight Miriam had spent years fighting to have installed. Azalea jumped out of the truck and ran to her mother's side. She dropped to her knees and tried to rouse her, clutching her arms, calling her name. Miriam's lips parted slightly. A breath came out, slow, low, but not quite a word. Azalea searched her body for a wound, anything to explain the state she was in, but like her father, she found nothing. She tried to sound calm when she called her brother, Luis Hector. She told him Miriam had been shot in the leg, but that she was stable. There was no need to rush, she said. Just be careful on the drive from Monterrey. Minutes passed. No ambulance came. When officers from the Ministerio Público finally arrived, they walked up to Miriam, checked her pulse, then exchanged a look that said more than words could. Azalea pleaded with them to take her to the hospital, but they refused. They said they had to wait for the ambulance. They said it was procedure, but eventually they relented. Ernesto backed the family truck up close, and together they lifted Miriam into the bed. Azalea ran into the house to grab a blanket to cover her. As they drove, she sat beside her mother, watching her chest rise and fall, hoping that the shallow rhythm meant there was still time. At the hospital, staff moved quickly. Nurses wheeled her down the hallway, donning gloves and calling for surgeons. The urgency gave Azalea hope. No one moved like that unless there was still a chance. She was given a sedative to calm her down, but the sense of unease only deepened. After a while, she noticed something had changed. The hallways had quieted. Staff no longer rushed. The tones had softened. There were fewer voices now, fewer footsteps, fewer doors opening and closing. A doctor, an old friend, entered the waiting room and took a seat beside her. She placed a hand on Azalea's arm and rubbed gently, trying to comfort her. Azalea pulled away. "Why aren't you with her?" she asked. "Why aren't you inside?" On the road to San Fernando, Luis Hector had managed to arrange a police escort. The drive took 2 hours. When he called Azalea again, she told him to come straight to the house, not the hospital. As the police vehicle turned onto Calle Margarita, he saw the van parked in front of the house. It belonged to forensic services. They don't show up unless someone has died. Inside the operating room, the lights had been dimmed. The only sounds came from the far end of the hallway. Miriam lay on a steel table, her body covered in a white sheet. Azalea stepped in alone. She pulled the sheet back, searching for some sign that her mother was still there, that the shallow breath she'd clung to on the ride to the hospital hadn't been the last. But the room was still. The chest no longer moved. There was no sound. Now the wounds were easier to see. Gunpowder burns ringed the entry points, mostly clustered around her legs. One bullet had passed beneath her arm and torn through her ribs. Azalea touched the edges, her fingers tracing the clean black circles, still trying to make sense of it. She stayed there for a while, unable to leave. It didn't feel real, not yet. The hospital staff eventually returned and told her gently that they needed to move the body. It was time to take her to Chalo's funeral home. Her brother was waiting. Her father, last she saw, had been wandering the hospital parking lot, dazed and silent. Miriam Rodríguez had spent years seeking justice for the murdered and disappeared. She had never stopped, even when others told her it was too dangerous. Now, someone had decided she needed to be silenced. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In the weeks following the murder of Miriam Rodríguez, the investigation into her killers expanded beyond the streets of San Fernando. One name began to surface again and again. A man known by the nickname Pata de Queso, Cheesefoot. He was 56 years old. In Cartel years, that made him ancient. His given name was never used. Among associates, he was simply Pata. According to local rumors, the name originated from an incident where he allegedly spied on a female cartel assassin while she was taking a shower. In retaliation, the woman reportedly stepped out of the bath and shot him in the foot. The nickname stuck. He was a regional boss for the Zetas, operating primarily out of Las Norias, a remote zone south of San Fernando. For years, he kept a low profile. He rarely entered the towns under his control, relying instead on lieutenants and foot soldiers to carry out orders. He avoided phones and stayed in the background, careful not to leave a trail. But when the Zetas lost control of San Fernando, after Miriam Rodríguez's campaign led to the arrest of their local leader, Pata de Queso stepped in. From that point forward, he began issuing commands that reached deep into San Fernando's criminal network. According to a dying Zeta named Rocco, it was Pata de Queso who gave the order to kill Miriam. The payment for the hit came from another figure in the group, a man known as El Hugo. At the time, authorities were already monitoring the phones of several cartel members. With help from Miriam's son, Luis Hector, investigators began piecing together connections, tracing phone activity, identifying voices. Every step pulled them closer to the top. In early November 2017, federal officer Paisa received a tip. Pata de Queso was sick, badly. He had been transported in an ambulance to the General Hospital in Ciudad Victoria. The condition was serious, liver failure. He was undergoing dialysis. Paisa and another officer found the ambulance driver and confirmed the location. Then, without backup, Paisa entered the hospital, posing as a Zeta. He found the room and walked in alone. Pata de Queso was lying in bed. His face was drawn, body slack, hair white. To Paisa, he looked less like a drug lord and more like a man from a nursing home, fragile, already slipping away. The arrest happened without resistance. He was placed in custody and transferred to Mexico City to face a growing list of charges. But he wouldn't make it that far. 3 days later, Pata de Queso was dead. The death occurred during the transfer to the capital. Paisa was on board the plane with him. At one point during the flight, he leaned in and asked a question that had haunted investigators for months. Why was Miriam Rodríguez killed? Para de Queso gave an answer, whether clear-minded or delirious. No one could say for sure. She was bringing the law down on us too much, he said. She was causing trouble. With Para de Queso dead, leadership of the region passed to El Hugo, the man who had paid for Miriam's murder. The chain of command remained intact, but the man who had given the order was gone. Her death, on Mother's Day, was an act that organized crime likely intended as a degenerate yet ingenious piece of criminal marketing, demonstrating their power, excising an enemy, and warning others against challenging them. Those who knew Miriam sometimes expressed surprise at her newfound boldness when she decided to go after her daughter's killers, while others recognized an inherent determination she had always possessed, citing past instances where she had located thieves or insisted on personally handling a ransom payment. According to her friend Chalo, the funeral director, Miriam was uniquely unafraid in San Fernando's climate of terror, once telling him that fear was merely a word. Engaging with the formal justice system proved to be a persistent challenge. Miriam frequently encountered officials who were either unwilling or unable to assist her. She learned to navigate the system's complex, often intentionally obfuscating language, which she felt was designed to make understanding difficult. To force action, she discovered she needed an inexhaustible well of patience and energy, and a deep understanding of the archaic bureaucratic processes. As Maria Inés Vera Hernandez, a mother who lost her son, recounted, Miriam's fierce support brought a measure of comfort and made her feel significantly less alone. Miriam's activism, while achieving concrete results including the identification and capture of several individuals involved in her daughter's case, came at a considerable and ultimately fatal personal risk. She was acutely aware that her actions had created enemies, not only among the cartel remnants she hunted, but also among resentful government officials who saw her as a nuisance or an obstacle. Her death sent shockwaves, becoming a significant media event and drawing widespread condemnation. The government quickly issued statements condemning the murder and vowing justice. However, questions immediately arose regarding the state's responsibility. Officials claimed Miriam had been provided protection through patrols. Yet this was contradicted by statements from others, including Gloria Garza from the State Human Rights Commission, who claimed Miriam refused protection due to distrust, and a video posted by Guillermo Riestra showing Miriam publicly requesting protection and complaining that her assigned police contact didn't answer his phone. An investigation by the Human Rights Commission later found that the state police tasked with her patrols had performed erratically and submitted falsified documentation when asked to prove they had carried out their duties. In the wake of her murder, the government made arrests. One individual, Misael, was detained after the white Nissan truck used in the killing was identified. He was reportedly wanted on another kidnapping charge, but was questioned about Miriam's murder while in custody. He was later sentenced to 15 years, a term Miriam's family privately felt was insufficient for murder. Another alleged perpetrator, Ella Luce, was killed in a confrontation with authorities later that year. Following Miriam's death, an anonymous note was taped to the entrance of the Ministerio Público, providing names and details of men involved in her murder, a document the government highlighted as key evidence. Miriam's legacy is multifaceted. Her relentless pursuit brought some of her daughter's killers to justice and recovered Karen's remains, providing a measure of closure. She transformed her grief into a powerful engine for change, becoming a symbol of resistance against fear and state indifference. She empowered countless other families of the disappeared, providing them with knowledge, support, and a collective voice in a society often numb to their suffering. Yet, her murder reinforced the ongoing, profound danger faced by activists and the persistent failure of the Mexican state to protect its citizens, particularly those challenging organized crime. The violence in San Fernando did not end with Miriam. Sources indicate the return of cartels and the perpetual cycle of conflict continued even after her death. Miriam's work brought out the state's shortcomings in forensic analysis, victim support, and providing security. Her story leaves behind unresolved questions about the depth of state complicity or incompetence, the true extent of the disappeared crisis. As Miriam herself noted, not even the government knows how many of us there are, and whether true justice and security can ever be achieved in places like San Fernando. Her son, Luis Hector, attempted to carry on her work, but the void left by his mother, described as the literal killing of a symbol of resistance, was immense, reflecting the difficulty of filling the space left by such a singular, powerful force.